All right, hello everyone. Thank you very much for attending this event. So today we have our guest speaker called Siddhartha Bandyopadhyay, who is an international economist in the field of crime. So basically, our guest speaker today has been awarded multiple prizes, including the Duncan Black Prize Award in 2015, and he has been interviewed by The Economist as well on his work in crime. So today, I would be honored to welcome our guest speaker, who is Siddhartha Bandyopadhyay from the University of Birmingham. So can I have a round of applause, please? Yeah, there you go. So thank you very much, sir. Maybe not to you to start the presentation. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, and thanks very much for allowing me to switch to Zoom since I was a bit unwell yesterday. So I was really looking forward to meeting in person, but still, at least being able to talk on Zoom and hopefully have some discussion is better than not being able to do it. Just to say what I'll be doing, I'll talk a bit about what I call reimagining the criminal justice system. By that, I mean thinking of what are the standard instruments of criminal justice policy and how to kind of utilize them. And then I'll give a little bit of evidence around one particular type of criminal justice policy, diversion programs. If I have time, I'll talk a little bit about who should be choosing what policy to get, and then open up for discussion. So let me just share my screen. Okay. So when we talk about, the sort of what we have as options for criminal justice policy, there are broadly three types of things people talk about in crime and criminal justice policy: prevention, reformation, or punishing. Now, a lot of people, whether it's the government, whether it's the ordinary public, whether it's criminal justice reformers, tend to frame this as an either-or choice. So, so you see a lot of things. If you read a lot of the tabloids, a lot of the comments are about, if somebody's committed a crime, we should just lock them up and throw away the key, suggesting extremely harsh punishments for most types of crime. A lot of people who work in reform, not surprisingly, talk about rehab and the inequalities associated with rehab programs. So the idea is that, well, yeah, rehab's fine, but who gets the opportunity for rehab? It's only the rich people or who go to rehab, while for the same crime, the poor go to prison, and sort of echoing the idea that there are lots of inequalities in the criminal justice system. Then the third is, and some of you may or may not recognize this, it was almost like the official policy of a certain government, seems far off now, which talked about being tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. This was actually Labour's sort of slogan, and part of the reason for Labour to sort of take the center and come back to power under Tony Blair. Because at that time, Labour was typically seen as left and soft on crime, and it tried to regain the center ground with. You can see a little bit of that today. So, when people talk about, again, prevent, reform, or punish, again, they seem to sort of talk in cliches. And to be honest, our politicians lead the way by sort of, our Home Minister, for instance, said, well, I want criminals to be absolutely terrified of the police. Well, yes, but how do you go about that? Or for the matter, the shadow deputy leader of the opposition made controversy recently by talking about, well, she believes in shoot first, ask questions later for terror suspects. It begs the question of how do you know who is and who is not really a criminal without due process and due trial? Now these sort of cliches have often made people in general, the general public, think also in terms of cliches, in terms of sound bites, that if you just do this, all crime will disappear. And we have this ideological divide between the so-called soft on crime and the so-called tough on crime people. I'd like to convince you that things are a little bit more subtle. So as I said, there are these three things. Let me just briefly encapsulate what are the sort of pertinent questions around these three instruments of crime policy, and then look at one in particular in a little more detail. So let's talk about, punish, which is sort of what a lot of people almost associate inevitably as with crime. And in fact, there's a book by Dostoevsky called Crime and Punishment, except that the irony is that the criminal actually is never caught and never punished in the traditional sense, but it's his own guilt from crime, which is the punishment. Anyhow, so why do people want to punish, and what happens after that? Well, typically, and knowing that at least some of people in the audience are kind of young economists, you might know that this idea is of punishment. One of the ideas around punishment is deterrence, that criminals are rational and that if you punish them, they will be deterred, not just specifically that somebody is punished and doesn't do the crime again, but also general deterrence. So if I know that, oh my God, if I do this, I've seen other people who've done the same are going to be punished, I'll be stopped from committing crime. Now, obviously, not all punishment follows from deterrence. There are many types of crime which are never, ever repeated. I can go into examples later. But nonetheless, the serious crimes and crimes that, should probably be punished in some way, simply to signal our disapproval for certain types of behavior. If you murdered someone, and it's clear from looking at data that that type of person almost never commits another murder, there might be not any value of specific deterrence, but you might still decide, well, no, we don't really say, oh, right, you committed a murder, don't commit another again. There you go. There's also the serious aspect people talk about, justice for victims, even though politically it has been overplayed a bit, in the sense that while victims want justice, it's not necessarily clear that victims necessarily want harsh punishment. They might want justice in the sense that, if something's been stolen, they want that thing back. They might want safeguards so that they don't get burgled or mugged again and so on. So, but nonetheless, it's certainly part of the criminal justice process is around, impact on victims. Now, obviously, acceptable forms of punishments have changed over the centuries. I'm not a historian, nor am I a moral ethicist, so I won't go a lot into that. Some of it obviously reflects the changing norms of society. But nonetheless, whatever type of punishment we impose has consequences for the individual. One of the biggest consequences often, if somebody is imprisoned, they often lose their skills and find it hard to get a job back, and therefore become a perpetual criminal. So, this idea of once a jailbird, always a jailbird, there's a criminogenic effect of punishment, which can actually increase crime. Obviously, punishment has an often negative impact on the person being punished, their families and networks. Again, there's a certain balancing of societal interests which have to be looked at. But there are certainly several channels through which punishment, or certain types of punishment, can increase reoffending. And so there's a trade-off between punishing and deterring crime versus punishing and increasing crime or reoffending. That's one instrument of policy. What about reform? Well, obviously, reform doesn't necessarily have to be divorced completely from punishment. But reform essentially, the focus is on modifying or addressing the behavior that caused the problem. If somebody is committing a crime out of economic need, the idea is to how are you able to address the economic need? If somebody is violent and doing things because they have mental health problems and drugs, probably locking them away is not going to solve the problem. The idea then is to look for, well, what should we do? What kind of treatment programs are available? And that's where this inequality that I talked about, that the poor go to prison while the rich go to rehab, sometimes comes in, simply because the rehab facilities are often not equitably distributed. Some of them, it's sometimes very hard to get, and therefore, because it's very hard to get, somebody with private resources may be able to afford a rehab program which cures the problem behind the crime while the poor people are not. That's part of what I if anybody had seen the flash sort of in my second slide, it's part of a larger program around, are the poor criminalized in various stages of the criminal justice system, which is one of my current projects, the variety of stakeholders I'm happy to talk about if you have time during discussion. So nonetheless, there's a lot of evidence that certain types of targeted rehab program, even if the only thing in the world you care about is to keep society safe and keep crime down, you might still opt for rehab programs. More generally, and this is where I'm going to give you some evidence around, some of the idea around reforming is to divert people away from the criminal justice system, either through addressing their needs around mental health or drugs and alcohol, or to make them understand in this thing called restorative justice, which at least many people in criminology might be familiar with, is to make them understand the consequences of their actions. So, a lot of people, sometimes do things foolishly, without realizing that it has consequences for the victim of the crime. I mean, you might think it's great fun to just maybe get drunk and just break someone's window. But if it's a vulnerable person, whose window you've broken, that might cause a lot of mental health problems for that person. So making people understand the consequences that crime has is another sort of tenet around reform. And, there's again, mixed evidence around that. In particular, one of the challenges is the evidence around youth crime in particular is quite mixed, and there's a challenge around what works in youth justice. I'll point out to some evidence that certain types of diversion programs, I mean diversion in two ways, either diversion away from custody or traditionally what would have been the sentence for that person, or diversion more imaginatively for certain types of, away from the traditional criminal justice system, can have beneficial effects in terms of reoffending behavior. And I'll give you a little bit of flavor around that, looking at a bit around my work and a bit around worldwide evidence on the effectiveness of these diversion programs. Okay? So that's reform. And then let's look at the third one, prevent, because it also allows me to introduce a little bit around the so-called new theories around the use of machines and artificial intelligence around crime policy. Is prevention, well, all this is fine, rehab and punishment. What if you could prevent crime in the first place? Maybe instead of just having random policing or just police reacting calls, if you know that there are certain problem areas, if you know that there's actually quite a bit of low level, sometimes high level violence, sometimes quite high level violence on certain streets on Saturday night or Friday night, people get, what if you had police presence there? What if you had what I call street pastors there? Wouldn't you be able to prevent a lot of that damage? So that's sort of the idea behind hotspot policing, which many people think is a success story. Not everybody thinks it's a success story, simply because if you target certain spots, those spots and people in those spots, you might prevent crime there. But if your targeting wasn't correct, you might actually be missing out on crime in other places. And therefore, you would associate people in that area with more crime, which may or may not be true compared to other places which you're not policing. Now, this hotspot policing becomes particularly problematic if you target problem families or individuals. If you think, oh, this individual coming from this family with their parents having served a prison sentence or having had drug problems, let's try and help them. With the best intentions in the world, this can cause problems because you might discover a lot of problems simply because you're looking, and there might be bigger problems elsewhere simply not picked up because you're not looking. And therefore, you might overestimate the risk of certain factors and certain families and sort of label them, and they become your problem families simply because you're not looking but you're letting your biases allow you to decide where to look for. This is the kind of case which many people make for, well, we shouldn't really leave it to the police or judges, and because they're biased human beings. We should look at data and look at an intelligent machine, like looking at advances in artificial intelligence to decide, all this kind of hotspot policing on where to target. I'll point out to you a little later that, again, some of these problems are not fully done away if you just use a machine. Some of these biases can actually be perpetuated. Nonetheless, these are the three instruments: prevention, reformation, and punishment about crime policy. And an imaginative crime policy, instead of looking for one or the other, should try to think of how do you distribute resources in an optimal way across these three different types of policies. And for that, you don't need slogans. What you need is evidence gathered carefully, because there are no magic bullets, carefully gathered evidence to decide what kind of programs to expand and what kind of programs to do away with. Just to say prevention, many people immediately think about Minority Report and all these kind of thought crime and so on. So obviously, I think we have to be a bit careful when we talk about prevention, what we are trying to prevent. Okay, that's sort of, if you like, the prelude of sort of first 1/3 of the talk. What I'm going to now present, not in great details, but I'm happy to discuss any of these results later on, is a bit of evidence. Well, I'm advocating diversion, but do I have any evidence to suggest that diverting people away from prison or diverting people away from the criminal justice system has any beneficial effects in terms of, reducing crime, making people safe, and so on? So the first is sort of a summary of some data that we analyzed using case disposals, which are available from the Ministry of Justice, but it's not available that easily, as in you have to make a request for it. And did work with my first PhD student, Siddhartha Bandyopadhyay, and two other co-authors. Background for that is, well, we see that worldwide, of course, there's a continued use of prison to punish, but prisons are expensive and socially divisive. I mean, as I said, it has an impact. If you go to prison, you lose your job skills, you meet other criminals, you develop networks, you come back, you can't get a job, and you become a criminal again. It has a huge negative impact on the families of prisoners, on the children of prisoners. You might create this intergenerational cycle. So a lot of social reformers say, well, we should do away with prisons when we can. But many people think, well, so you can't do that because prisons actually work. They prevent crime. You wanted to understand, well, perhaps prisons do prevent crime, but do other types of alternatives to prison also prevent crime? That allows us to at least start a discussion around rehab and its form. The research questions that we asked in this paper is, even if you're looking at the narrow lens of reducing crime, forget the welfare of, for the moment, of prisoners and their families, just look at the narrow lens of reducing crime. Should we be using custodial sentences or non-custodial sentences? Should that imposition vary by crime type? Maybe custodial sentences are okay for certain types of crimes and even appropriate. Maybe it's less appropriate for certain other types of crime. Maybe it's less effective. And then, should we use different sentences on juveniles and adults? And I'm not going to talk much about juveniles simply because when we did the stats with the data that we have, nothing was significant. In other words, you could neither prove nor disprove any of our hypotheses. I mean, there are reasons for that. Some of it was smaller data, some of it was the aggregated level probably didn't allow us to distinguish enough around youth crime. And how do these custodial, non-custodial interact with the institutional details? Because, you can't look at prison, which is perhaps well-funded, versus community resolutions, which are not well-funded. So I think one has to be careful what conclusions one draws. Okay. Just quickly, what is the classifications? Well, we classified custodials as those which are immediate prison sentences or suspended sentences. We could have put the suspended sentence in the non-custodial block. We did that, didn't make much difference to the results. Non-custodials are fines, community service, conditional discharge, absolute discharge, happy to talk about any of them in details, but I mean, conditional discharge, as it suggests, you escape prison provided you stay out of crime for the next 3 years. Absolute discharge, yes, the crime has been committed. Technically, it might deserve a prison sentence. There are enough circumstances where they're extenuating, which makes it not in societal interest to imprison the person. We use panel level data, which means we had data across time and across police force areas. We had 4 different types of offenses, which we looked at. Violence against a person. Why did we look at these 4 broad categories? Because then we were able to match the entire data set in these 4 broad categories with some socioeconomic variables around unemployment, around wages and so on, which also affect crime. So the 4 big types of crime were violence against a person, sexual offenses, robbery, and property crime. We had data on the conviction rate for each year, for each police force area, for these 11 years. And we could separate by juvenile and adult offenders. But to understand that the effect was coming from these variations in conviction rate of these different types of disposal, whether it's custodial or non-custodial, we also needed to control for statistically control for things around unemployment, police officers, expenditure, and proportion of young people. Why proportion of young people? Because certain ages are supposed to be more crime prone because perhaps they're more impulsive and various other things. And that might be affecting our results. So essentially, these are our main results. What did we do? Well, since you're economists mostly, you probably know enough econometrics. What we did is we ran different types of regression analysis, tried to control for time effects, things which happen over time, things which differ across police force areas. And then these are our sort of associations. What we found is that community sentences are actually quite effective at reducing crime for robbery and property crime. Custody is effective at violence against person offense, but it's ineffective for robbery, less effective than community sentence for property crime. So what it's saying is that, yes, you can imprison people and that would reduce property crime, theft and burglary essentially. But you can also achieve reductions in that through use of community sentences. And I'll show you a little bit of an illustration. And then, very weakly conditional discharge is effective against violence against a person and sex offenses, partly because these conditions essentially put some kind of carrot and stick policy saying, well, get the treatment that you need to manage your anger or your impulses, and then you'll avoid prison. And that creates a kind of incentive for people to try to stick to that program. For young people, nothing much. I mean, we do have some evidence that community sentence is effective at reducing robbery and custody at violence against a person. One interesting finding for young people, fines are actually a good tool. And I think part of that comes from the fact that I guess it's often the parents who pay the fine and perhaps try to keep the young person in line. Now, this obviously has broader questions around, the affordability of fines for some parents versus other parents, creating this inequality in the criminal justice system. Obviously, the point of this statistical exercise wouldn't be able to pick that up, but that's again a larger question, which might. So you need to caveat when going to policy about fines, because that creates an inequality in the criminal justice system. I'll give you a couple of illustrations and then talk a little bit more about another paper and then make more speculative comments about the use of artificial intelligence. Okay. Okay, so here's and this is purely illustrative and, but based on those regression results, what it's telling us is that if you actually if you increase the conviction rate so if you put 1% more people, convict 1% more people to custody, you can reduce violence against a person in a typical year in England and Wales by, you get 1153, basically 1100 crimes. If you around, this is the kind of marginal effect you'd get. Similarly, you'd be saving 102 sexual offenses. On the other hand, you would get not much of an impact for, certain types of crime. In fact, it seems that increasing custody for robbery actually increases robbery. It could be that sending people to prison, robbery is a crime which depends on teamwork and networks. Putting people to prison might actually improve their networks, and they become better robbers next time. That is, this is just an illustration, and I won't go too much into it, but let me go into where I think it's most marked, and that's for property crime. If you do the same for property crime, so at the moment, generally around just over 2.2 million people commit some kind of property crime, which is recorded by the police. A 1% increase in conviction rate for custody would reduce property crime by just over 2,500, which is good. But what's really interesting is that if instead you give a community sentence, that also creates crime reduction effects and is much cheaper. You'd actually reduce more crime, about 3,500, but obviously at about 1/5, 1/10 of the cost. So in particular, if you were to take away a punchline from this paper, it would be, well, property crime, if you really believe there's a lot of deterrence, the deterrence doesn't have to come from prison. It can come from properly designed community sentences. I'd go further. It can come from community sentences as they're designed today, which those who study criminal justice policy will tell you is far from perfect. But even with an imperfectly designed community sentence, you can reduce property crime through the use of community sentences. That suggests that even if you care about reoffending and deterrence, you don't have to do that through prisons. That's sort of the punchline of the paper. Now, these, mind you, are some of these, especially, certain types of violence, property crime, can be quite high-level crimes. Often, if you want to look at prevention and you want to nip things in the bud, you want to rehab, you have to go a bit further, look at low-level offenses. That's often how people start. And you want to look at, can you do better in low-level offenses by avoiding this processing within the criminal justice system, whether it's a fine or even a community sentences. And that's the next paper. But this, I won't go into the conclusion because I've already given the punchline. The punchline is not super clear what happens with violent crime and things like that, but we know for property crime, there are alternatives to custody which are effective. So let's go into this sort of, take one layer back. Forget the fact that, or let's not limit ourselves to the fact that we only talk of things within the criminal justice system. Can you process low-level offenders outside the criminal justice system through what's called community resolution, which is essentially, if the offender admits certain things, admits his or her offense, writes to the victim, does community service, restores the damage to the property or pays over time the things stolen, you don't process that person within the criminal justice system. Would such a resolution outside the criminal justice system help in reoffending? So people who are given community resolutions versus similar people, obviously you need that group to be similar, who are not given a community resolution but are instead processed to the criminal justice system, are their subsequent histories different? That's sort of the point around the paper. Again, we are very lucky because it's hard to study this without looking at the individual levels, data and individuals within that. So we were able to get finely grained, anonymous, but data at the individual level, and link it with their reoffending history. So we had a bunch of people, some of whom were assigned to community resolution simply because maybe that particular police officer had an interest in it or the victim agreed to that, versus the much bigger bunch of people who were just processed business as usual through the criminal justice system. Okay. We matched people so that we got sort of like for like. So you use something called propensity score matching. So we matched people in the group which got community resolution so that there were people with similar offenses, because there's no point, comparing apples and oranges. So we want people who've committed similar offenses, similar age group, similar employment status, similar gender, because males and females, again, might have different propensities for reoffending. And then compare the reoffending of groups who got community resolution versus people who are processed business as usual. Okay. This was the data around these individuals. It had offender characteristics such as gender, age at first offense, ethnicity, employment status, nationality. Also includes what crime they have committed, what was the police outcome, in other words, were they given a community resolution or not, and if they did reoffend, when it happened. This is sort of the data again. What were the results? The results were actually quite consistent and robust, that all offenders who received community resolution, their reoffending rate was about 10% lower. And by the way, 10% is a big number when you think of, if you do this for hundreds and thousands of people and you get 10% less reoffending, that's a lot. Versus, so if the reoffending rate was, say, 40% versus 36%, 10% lower, that's quite a lot of less reoffending. That's a lot of crime saved to society. And also a lot of, so what you're saying is there's a double benefit. One, if you use community resolution, these people on an average reoffend less. Two, community resolution saves you all the costs of the criminal justice system, which can be reserved for more serious crimes, and has other indirect benefits like it shortens the time for people to be resolved for serious crimes and things like that. But that's actually quite big if this holds across other areas and other police force areas and across other types and other time periods. Our results are consistent and robust when we test across various subsamples. So we look at male only, we look at people who are employed, unemployed. Obviously, the magnitude slightly varies. Slightly lower for younger people. Again, not surprising because, this whole rational deterrence thing, we're only just not fully understanding what community resolutions actually work well for youth offending. I might be able to tell you the answer after 3 years because I'm actually looking at 3 large-scale programs and evaluating them over 3 years. So maybe I'll have a better idea after that. But overall, this is a very promising area and pretty much under-focused. What's the conclusion, the punchline? Suggests that actually, if you're thinking about punishment, custody is not the only one. If you're thinking of beyond punishment, there are other alternatives like stop processing people who have low-level offenses in the criminal justice system. This is not just UK. There's very similar worldwide data. So recently, I heard a talk about a year ago around some US initiatives around community, about where this one step further. For low-level offenses, some prosecutors, some assistant prosecutors are a bit more lenient, some less. And there's almost random assignment of who gets, you might be lucky, you might get an assistant prosecutor who's very lenient, said, okay, don't do it again, off you go. And others who say, no, we just book you. People who weren't booked, who had to go through this fear, oh my God, I might get booked, but ultimately were let off, actually reoffended less than those who were put in the criminal justice system. So, it's a growing body of evidence that actually the best thing you can do sometimes is not process people through the criminal justice system. Now, obviously, lots of caveats. I'm not suggesting you do it for high-level offenses. It's just not, feasible for those sort of things. It's not probably the right thing to do for those kind of offenses. But part of our reimagining should be about understanding when to process people in the criminal justice system and when not to. Even if all we care about is crime, the best way to stop some types of crime is sometimes not by not being tough on crime. That's sort of the issue. Now, the point is, you might say, well, the fact that some prosecutors let you off after telling you very gravely never to do it again, and others do, points to an inequity in the criminal justice system. And I'll use the last 3 to 5 minutes before discussion, just talking about, is this really fair? Aren't we letting fallible human beings, make decisions which have serious consequences for people on the basis of their, biases and prejudices? And wouldn't it be better if you had some criteria okay, if you do these kind of things, you'll have community resolution if you do this, and have some kind of a data-driven process? That's what we mean by saying, would an artificial intelligence or a machine do this better? Okay. Now, machines, by the way, are not any less prone to errors than human beings. Let me just, and this is, this is sort of, obviously, I'm taking a particularly extreme example to drive home this point. So here's the data on machines. So what do machines do? Machines soak up data from, look at who are the people likely to reoffend, their characteristics, their family characteristics, their various things, and then decide, oh, this is low risk, this is high risk, and so on. But the data itself could be biased. They might be picking the wrong thing. So maybe if you look at families of people who've committed crime, but as I said, if certain families are targeted more because of ethnicity or income, you might be mistakenly thinking that people who have low incomes are more prone to offending. That's incorrect because your data was biased. Your data, because you simply focused, maybe with the best or the worst of intentions, on certain people. Another way is to not understand that actually the data you're looking at might be the wrong person. So that's, I think, really, really important to look at. And this particular paper, I'm going to summarize in 2 minutes and then conclude, says, well, let's be clever. Machines can look at facial expressions, and then these scholars decided that look at faces of convicted criminals versus faces randomly drawn from CVs of people. So maybe somebody looked at my CV, took a picture and made it part of the data, and then took pictures of convicted criminals, took part of the data, looked at facial expressions and said, oh, the machine accurately predicts, after training it on these are criminal photographs, these are non-criminal photographs, on predicting who would be criminals and who would be not from pictures. Okay, I'm not even going to get into this issue of privacy, human rights, and so on. This is crazy because they're picking up the wrong variable. They looked at facial expressions to predict criminality, but facial expressions can change. I might smile when I meet you. I might smile for my pictures on my web, and I might look pleasant. They're comparing those pleasant pictures with pictures of people who are looking grim when they have been booked for a crime, which obviously has a different facial expression, which is mutable, and trying to convince people that they have a good machine learning program. The point I'm trying to make, I know I'm running out of time, keep this short, is that machines can only do a good job if you feed in good data to the machine. So it's like, when they first taught us computers, they said, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. A friend of mine calls it GIGO, Giga. Giga is 10 power 20. Now with machine learning, you've got huge amounts of amounts of data, but it's still garbage in, garbage out, but magnified. So yes, you can potentially, there is a case for machines and data-driven approaches, which could, and particularly for simple things, it could, reduce time and error. And indeed, machines improve over time. But ultimately, if your machine uses historical data which is biased, so suppose there is data that which overestimates the risk of certain ethnic groups because they were policed more than other groups, then they're going to make you false predictions if you use that to predict risk and predict recidivism. And this will be perpetuated because they'll say, oh, this is data driven, but it's not data driven. It's data fed in by biased human beings, which gives you inaccurate answers and inaccurate predictions. I'm all for AI, I'm all for data. I'm a data person myself. But if you don't understand the theory behind data, if you cannot de-bias your data, then machines or AI are not your solution. They can help. I take the view, I'm neither an AI optimist nor pessimist. I'm an AI pragmatist. I think AI has great scope. But let's not forget the theory behind AI. I mean, AI is only as good as the data being fed. Without good data, you can't get rid of bias. So just summing up, criminal justice policy is not an either or. You have to think in the right combination of punishment, rehab, and prevention. There's a good evidence that sometimes not processing people within the criminal justice system has good results for offending. You can keep the public safer in that way. Now, there's a lot of variation in how we approach the criminal justice system, and there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of impetus to let data now do the talking instead of human beings. But if that data is based on biased samples collected because of biased policing and criminal justice policies in the past, that alone will not correct the bias. There are ways to do it, but a purely data-driven approach without understanding what and where the data has come from is not going to make you reimagine the criminal justice system. You need to probe much more deeply. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen to allow me to interact a little better with questions and discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for that brilliant presentation and talk. Brilliant. We really enjoyed it. So I'm going to start with the questions from the audience. If you have any questions, just either say it or send it to me personally in the group and the Zoom chat. Yeah. And then I've got a question. Want to say it personally, or would you prefer sending it here?
I'm okay either way, but obviously, if people say that if it doesn't come through, you might have to repeat the question to me, but that's fine too.
Yeah, that's so. Okay, I think they prefer sending it there on Zoom.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Could you please ask him if he can explain a little bit more about the community resolution system?
Okay, so we have a, I don't know if you caught that. We have a honourable member asking about. Could you just elaborate more about the
community resolution?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so community resolution for certain types of low-level offenses, say some kind of low-level criminal damage of just, you in the heat of the moment you punch someone in the face, or you got drunk and indulge in antisocial behavior. Community resolution allows you not to be processed through the criminal justice system if you follow certain things, like maybe you write a letter of apology to the person you did the harm to. If you've done something which can be made right, you do that. You agree to sometimes not attend a mentoring program to understand why you caused this behavior, and then you don't have a police record. If you do this successfully for X number of months, it could be 3 months, 6 months, you don't have a police record. It might still show up on an enhanced check. What was the CRB check? Now it's called the DBS check, but you don't have a criminal record if you do these things.
That could be regarded as a out of court settlement, sort of.
Yeah, it's an out of it falls in the broad category. So CR is a type of what's called out of court disposal. I mean, it's not the only type of. I mean, there are other out of court disposals, but this is one particular type. It often has a restorative justice element, as in where you kind of, engage with the victim and make that and sort of acknowledge your fault and try to see what damage this has caused. It doesn't always have to be physical damage it has caused the victim.
But now I'm running full of questions. So yeah.
Can you ask him his opinion on the Norway information system?
Could you just say again?
Can you ask him his opinion on the Norway information system?
Norway information system. Reformation system, Norway. So we have a question. What's your opinion on the Norwegian reformation system or criminal?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is, for those in the rehab, prevention, reformation group, Norway or Nordic countries in general are held up as sort of the gold standard. They have a much less punitive regime. Their crime rates are lower. So the simple conclusion drawn would be, well, see, this is where we need to go. Being harsh on crime isn't helping. And some of what I was telling you is probably in the same direction. I just want to check a couple of things to slightly caveat it. One is, simply transplanting Norway to the UK or the US, which are more punitive, won't necessarily straight away give you Norway's crime rates, because the population, the employment opportunities, the distribution of, the inequalities in society which drive crime are different across Norway, across US, across the UK. What we can learn from Norway, obviously, is that there is certainly any type of rehab or even punishment, if it's accompanied by things which will help you reintegrate in society, are good for crime prevention. Some of the best evidence around prisons actually being crime reducing comes from Norway, which is a little bit of a surprise sometimes from criminal justice reformers. But that comes because while you're in prison, you still are allowed to retrain for employment opportunities. So once you come out of prison, you're not forced to go back to crime. So my sort of nuanced view would be, there's a lot we can learn from Norway. Can't transplant it straight away, but we have to remember, we have to invest in the kind of skills that is encouraged within the reformative system if we are to replicate Norway.
Brilliant. Any follow-up questions? Okay.
So a follow-up question on the previous one about CR, where he said it's for what would be considered like low-level crimes. But if we look at like the 1960s and we look at where we are now, what was considered a low-level crime then, or what is considered a low-level crime now is not the same. So what do they use as like a measure? And also because it's between people in the community, one person may feel like this is a low-level crime, I don't mind not going to the justice system, but somebody else may feel like, no, I want to go to the justice system for this. So how do they balance like public, how the public influences that?
Yeah, so I think I more or less understood the question, but if I missed anything, just tell me. So one of the things that I recognize when we say low level, it seems to assume a certain value judgment, but I think it's so there are certain things which the police and magistrates would consider. So I think what I said, low level criminal damage or bodily harm. So somebody's punched you in the face, but you don't have a lasting injury. Somebody, I don't know, sprayed graffiti outside your wall. Now, obviously, it may not be low level. So one of the things around community resolution is that the victim has to agree to it. Whether that's necessarily good or bad is a different issue, because clearly it makes certain things arbitrary, that some victims are more forgiving than others. that's the basis of many penal systems, incidentally. And, there's a lot of, and I think in a way it's difficult without that, because otherwise you won't have public support for it. So yes, I mean, somebody might feel very badly affected and say, well, no, I want this person processed through the criminal justice system. I think as we get more and more evidence that community resolution actually does well, it is going to be easier to convince victims that, we are not actually being lenient, we're actually helping this person. And therefore, you're less likely to be a victim because the offending will be lower. So, I think you need, I think I'll just use this opportunity to just say something. A lot of people say politicians try to be tough on crime because the public demand it. Well, if you give public the right kind of evidence, I mean, do you think if you tell them that community resolution actually reduces the offending, people are going to still insist on criminal justice processing? Some may, but surely the level of public support is a level of the evidence presented to the public. But anyhow, so I think that answers the question around what is low level, what is, definitely, yes, different victims will have different views. Our concept of low level, of course, I think you said something about, yeah, of course it changes with, at one time, in medieval England, if you committed theft for more than 6 pence, you are hung. So that would be considered, not considered in the same way today. So yeah, those change over time. Is there anything I left out in the question?
I think that was basically the idea behind, shift in culture leading to shift in perception of a crime. So I think that was basically the idea behind it. Do you have a question? Oh, yes, we do.
Do you think less processing of crime can be counterproductive?
Less
Processing of crime can be
less percentage.
less processing. Like how he said, we should process crime less.
Or can be effective.
Can be counterproductive.
So the question basically is, do you think having less criminal justice process can be counterproductive? It can backfire, for example.
I mean, yes. So, I mean, so I think all the evidence is around the margin that some shift away from the criminal justice to non-criminal justice helps. So maybe a 5% shift away is going to be actually beneficial. A huge shift away, we don't know what the effects will be. I mean, it's a bit like most of the things that we say is talking about changing things at the margin. We know that perhaps if you're eating too much, eating a bit less is going to be good for your health. That doesn't mean starving is necessarily good for the health. So shifting certain types of things away from the criminal justice system is good. Yeah. I don't necessarily, whether an overhaul of it, and just dismantling it as some people want, whether, defunding police and so on is going to be good. Don't know. My guess would be no, but so all the things that I'm saying is talking about trying to push some people for low-level offenses away from CJs, pushing people who would be at the margin, not be in prison or prison, perhaps consider whether, other types of sentences would be better. Whether once you do that, you can gather more evidence around whether more holes, and then you can see some whole-scale dismantling sometimes work doesn't. So I mean, I don't know whether globally what the answer to that is. I think we should be modest about what we know and what we don't know.
Thank you very much. I think one of the last questions. Yes, please.
Have you considered that maybe the problem is not the number of people that are being processed into the system, but what the system has been created to be? So for example, if you take somebody who is convicted murder and you throw them into prison, they are basically surrounded by people who have also done similar things, like people who have stolen at like high levels and things like that. So the environment where they are put in doesn't really provide a place where somebody can actually reform. They don't, like, for example, things like going to the library and doing work is optional instead of mandatory. So it's not really an environment that actually does help people be reformed. So they come out and they're just the same people. It's just that they've been taken away from society for a certain amount of time. Not much change has happened, and they're put back into society again.
Okay, I think I sort of understand, but tell me if I have not. I think what you're saying is that a couple of things. One is that, you know, the environment which breeds criminality, right? That's really important. I mean, if you're in a neighborhood in which other people commit crime, and actually one of the best predictors of crime is crime in that neighborhood, you know, your probability of committing a crime. So absolutely. And I think that's, so when we imagine, you know, rehabs, you have to, that's exactly the kind of thing that you have to look at. I mean, so a couple of organizations that are kind of currently looking at to seeing the effectiveness of the program exactly looks at this, you know, young men and women at risk of violence, who are violent, you know, in a violent neighborhood. Are there ways in which they can find an alternate to their self-expression? I mean, one of the things I'm looking at is, can they find creative expressions? Maybe they like music, maybe it's music mentoring, maybe they need focused mentoring sessions with people who are role models, because if all they see around us are, you know, people who've committed crimes and have those kind of things, they're not going to change. And that's why sometimes these, you know, the diversion programs really need to work in changing the perception and environment in which people are. And similarly, just, and that goes back, whatever this, whether it's in the community, because these people have not been put to prison, or whether once you know, if you have to, just as in Norway, even in Norway, some people go to prison, you still have to change an environment where they upskill or change their attitudes. Again, let's not be global. It could be there are some people whose attitudes you cannot change, but at the margin, these are more likely to help. So I think, yeah, what you're saying about the environment, and a lot of criminal justice policy doesn't consider the environment, and then, you know, sometimes it doesn't work and people are disappointed. They shouldn't be disappointed because it hasn't looked at that environment and tried to take these young people sometimes, or even older people, away from their environment. Yeah.
I believe that answers the question. Any final questions?
So wouldn't you say that some people going through reformation may get like more ideas, because some serial killers like John Wayne Gacy, he also went through like reformation. He was said to be a better person, so they let him go early. But then he went and, you know, serial killer. You know, some people can like manipulate the system in a way that makes it seem
I get
that
you.
they're different.
Yeah, I think the question is that just basically regarding the efficiency of reform programs. So when people go to prison, they normally tend to, for example, get early parole and early release from prison, but then they tend to manipulate the system and get the early release, and then after that go on to do even worse stuff after being released from prison. So the question is regarding your opinion on the efficiency of reform programs, really.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, the fact that a small percentage of people commit crime after early release, not a surprise. I mean, why do we expect the early release program to be perfect? No system is perfect. And I think people's views get distorted because all the people who do badly on early release are the ones where you see media highlight. I mean, the percentage of people who are on early release and who actually lead a quiet life never makes the headlines. So I think our perceptions get distorted. I can't often give you the figures on early release programs, but generally that, you know, if anything, I think parole boards tend to be on the conservative side. So notwithstanding some, you know, obviously you'd like it to be 100% efficient, but given human behavior, you would never get a system. And I think we should be honest and admit that we should always try to do better, because every failure means that somebody was murdered or somebody was robbed and somebody was harmed, which you don't want. But you have to compare that with what happens if you don't do that. And because, as I said, there's a criminogenic effect. The longer you keep people in prison, the less skills they have, they come back and commit more crime. There are other costs to society. So I think, you know, we should be asking these hard questions and admitting that no program is 100% safe. I mean, I totally take your point, but I don't think, you know, So we can, when you compare of the efficiency, we would like it to be 100%. What would we regard as good? That's an open question. It's a good question, but it's an open question. I don't think it's realistic to assume it to be 100%.
Thank you very much. One question that really fascinated me, by the way, is from the figures that you presented, one of your slides, you showed that custodial sentence tended to reduce reoffending rates for the 4 or 3 crimes there, but we saw an increase in robbery reoffending from custodial sentence. So why is that?
Now, I mean, there are, you know, it's difficult to know that. I think there are 2 plausible explanations. One is obviously there are other factors which affect robbery, which we haven't controlled for in our regression. That's one possibility. Yeah, so we just haven't got it right. The other is that robbery is a group crime, right? So you do need people to plan, and in prison you're more likely to meet with criminal networks who would help you with your next robbery. So prisons is a breeding ground. I mean, that's the whole point people make about, you know, you go to prison, you come out with, nobody wants to employ you, but you met lots of people who give you lots of opportunities in the criminal world. And robbery being a group crime, maybe, you know, that's more plausible for robbery, that you go and therefore you know, get more opportunities for robbery and therefore you do more robbery. You know, you can take your pick which explanation you like.
It does make sense here. So any last question, final question for today. Okay, no question from the audience. So I think that would be all the questions we have today. Thank you very much. So we had, I forgot to mention this, but we had the Criminology Society as part of today's event. I forgot to mention that at the start of the event, which I should, but I thank both you and the Criminology Society and our members for being here today, both online and in person. I would have enjoyed to have you in person as well. They all would, you know, to have a coffee or something, you know, drink as well in person.
Yeah, so would I. You know, I fell under the weather at just the wrong time, but at least, you know,
Yeah.
we didn't have to cancel it, which is something.
Yeah, that's good.
So yeah, but thanks again for inviting me. It was fun.
Yeah, it was really, and we enjoyed it. So this for you today was the internationally recognized economist, Siddhartha Bandyopadhyay, and his brilliant talk on crime. And we thank you very much, sir. And thank you all members for joining today's event. And we'll see you soon next time then. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot, Shuman. Bye.